Hello, class. I'm sorry we're not having class tonight. Things kind of come up. Anyway, since we're a little bit behind anyway, I wanted to go ahead and just kind of talk to you about the next chapter in our book. It's called The Market Revolution. Don't really have a whole heck of a lot to say about it, so we'll just kind of hit the highlights. And then when we get back to class next week, we'll get into Henry Clay and the Jacksonian era, and we'll be able to catch up pretty soon after that. I have no doubt. We still got plenty of time. Anyway, so the book. I really kind of hate the order that your book goes into. Normally, I like to go ahead and do the Jacksonian era now, but your book is kind of different in that it goes to the market revolution first. And what the market revolution is, it is the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And I say the beginnings because the Industrial Revolution does not really come to the United States really full force until after the Civil War. So, what did the world look like? What did the country look like during this time? Well, before 1815, most farmers just produced enough food to kind of feed themselves, their families, and to maybe trade a little bit. After 1815, we began to see more commercial farms. Think of that as agribusiness or whatever we call that today. Um, we began to see some magazines actually devoted to farming. In 1819, a man named Jethro Wood, Wood, introduced the iron plow, which made plowing a heck of a lot easier, which meant that you didn't need as much manpower on the farms, which meant that since you had all them big old families that not everybody was needed anymore, so you're going to begin to see the beginnings of a very small number of people from rural areas go into the cities to find work. Um, so we also have during this time a guy named John Deere, and you probably have heard of John Deere, pretty popular, seems to be the most popular farming equipment in this area. Improved the design of the iron plow, made it to where horses or oxen or other beasts of burden could actually pull it. Um, we also see for the first time the crank powered churn, which made things like making butter easier. I don't know if you've ever tried to churn butter, but you like churn for like 4 hours, you end up with like this much butter. So you got enough for one piece of toast. So that makes it a lot easier now. So we can all enjoy butter. Yay, butter. Um, so what's going to start happening is as we get more into a commercial mindset, farmers will begin to concentrate on crops that they can sell so they can make money. In the South, the Deep South, they were mostly concerned with things like cotton, tobacco to an extent. In the Midwest, they're going to focus on grain, especially wheat. On eastern farms, they tended to do livestock and dairy because those farms tended to be a little bit more rocky and yeah, tended to have harsher winters there. So they tended to work on the livestock and the dairy. Um, Now, what we're going to begin to see because of this move toward agribusiness and this move toward profitability is it's really going to change community values, especially in the South. It changes the way that farmers are going to farm. Basically, before everyone was in competition with each other, and you see this in a lot of communities now today, you had harvest festivals really about this time of year. Well, I guess probably about a week ago now, where what you would do is you would go farm to farm and you would help all of your neighbors harvest their crops, and then you'd have a big old celebration at the end. Well, now that you're in direct competition with your neighbor, it doesn't really do you much good to help him out, right? Um, you want to make sure that you make sure your stuff gets to the market, and you're not so worried about other people. By the way, in our area, what we call the upcountry South, southern farms tended to focus on producing food for the family with a small portion for commercial crops. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. Some southern states even had laws against fencing where you weren't allowed to put up fence to keep livestock out. So basically, in the South, you had this whole willy nilly thing where like cows and whatnot were just able to kind of walk around and do what they want. Um, sure, it was just a colossal pain for everybody involved. Um, so one of the things that's going to be really important to this quote unquote market revolution will be internal improvements to transportation. It'll make it easier to get produce to market. It lowers the cost of doing business. And it helps spread information and new ideas through books, almanacs, and newspapers. And we begin to see more books and almanacs. We also began to build a network of roads and turnpikes by the 1820s. Roads and turnpikes will connect much of the Northeast and the Eastern Seaboard, making it easier to travel in those places. In New York State, there was a large program of road building. They added 4,000 miles of roads and turnpikes by 1820. We will see the first federally funded national road, which at first will go from Cumberland, Maryland to what is today Wheeling, West Virginia. If you kind of look on the map, it doesn't seem like that far. But you got to remember, this was a new idea for the government to actually spend money on infrastructure. It's a question we still struggle with today. By the 1830s, it'll go as far west as Columbus, Ohio. You can still, I think, drive on parts of the national road. I honestly think it's Route 66. I should have checked before I started the lecture. But it is still kind of there. So if you want to go into the footprints of your forebears, you can kind of take a trip on that road. Watch for tolls, though. In Pennsylvania, they built the Lancaster Turnpike, which will eventually connect Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and all sports fans now know that was a horrible mistake. But this will make transportation easier and cheaper. It will cut travel time to the cities. One of the most important inventions for river trade will be the steamboat. It made it actually possible to travel upriver. Basically, what would happen if you lived in some place like Kentucky or Ohio and you weren't on the eastern seaboard, if you were going to do international trade, it made a whole lot more sense to go down the Kentucky River, go down the Ohio River, go to the Mississippi River, and go out through the port of New Orleans. That was the easiest way to move freight. And that's the way that the river flowed. Now, if you wanted to try to have something brought to you from Mississippi, from New Orleans up here, that cost a lot of money because going upriver is a lot harder than going downriver. But the steamboat changes that. And so what it does is it gives us, for the first time, legitimate two-way travel on the rivers. Now, you'll still see some steamboats. There's some luxury liners. I think some are casinos. In Louisville, Kentucky, there's a steamboat race every year between Kentucky and Ohio. So they're not really used so much for freight anymore, but this was really a game changer. If you're interested in reading kind of popular culture or literature about it, check out Mark Twain. In fact, Mark Twain gets his name from two terms about the steamboat. Had to do with measuring the water to make sure you didn't get stuck. Anyway, it will create boom. It will create a boom to river towns like St. Louis, New Orleans. Well, New Orleans is doing okay, but New Orleans is doing better now. Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, cities like that. Though Louisville had its own kind of issues. They had to navigate around the fall. They finally figured that out. Now, one other way that we're going to get around is the canal. Now, when you probably hear the term canal, you probably think about the Venetian canals, or if you think about any in this country, maybe you think of the Panama Canal down in Central America. But if you think of one in this country, you probably think of the Erie Canal. Canals are actually kind of an interesting way, and it looked for a long time like that would be the way that we would travel in certain areas. Since the 1780s, we had private companies build small canals. By 1817, there were about 100 miles of canals in use. In 1817, the governor of New York, a guy named DeWitt Clinton, decided to build a canal linking Buffalo on Lake Erie to Albany on the Hudson River, over 300 miles apart. New York raised $7 million for the project. It became a success. It cut travel time and cost, and boosted towns like Rochester, Buffalo, and Syracuse. This begins a wave of canal building. However, and there will be 3,300 miles of canals in this country by 1840, costing roughly about $125 million, and that's when $125 million was real money. However, after about 1840, the use of canals began to wane. Now, I'm going to tell you here in a second what actually derailed the canals. And if you could tell by my terrible, terrible uncle joke, the answer is trains. Now, trains had actually been in use since the 14 or 1500s in mines in Germany, and they were being pulled by horses. So, what happens in the 1800s is you really began to see people using the steam engine, and they began to build motors that could actually pull trains. In 1825, the first commercial railway operated in England. In this country in 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio successfully tested a steam engine and began railroad usage. We began to see more railroad usage by 1840. There will be more tracks than canals. Boston to New York now only took half a day. The railroads will be seen as an agent of civilization, but some will be concerned about the destruction of nature. If you take the second half class with me, we're going to look at the Transcontinental Railroad and how it forever changed the West. So if you kind of want to see the pros and cons of trains, that's something to look forward to if you decide to take that class. All of this will aid in communication. It takes less time to send letters. One of the great inventions of the time is 1844. Samuel Morse, M-O-R-S-E, introduced the telegraph machine. That's the dots and the dashes. I used to be able to do SOS, but so very few people do this. I think my niece might be able to still do it. Oh, by the way, I want to thank my niece. She is the one who is videoing this, and she's doing a fine job, I'm sure. So what this did is you put up poles, you put up wires, and you can send near instantaneous communication anywhere that was wired. He sent the first message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore in, of course, Morse code that he invented. The first message that he ever saw was, quote, "What hath God wrought?" unquote. What hath God wrought? So that doesn't really sound like a positive thing. It sounds like a threat to me, but there we are. In the 1850s, we'll see companies like Western Union come to existence. That was their first job, was to be a hub for telegraphs. And of course, they'll spend a long time doing telegrams and telegraphs, and now I guess they're about money now. We also began to see better print technology by 1835. There will be 1,200 newspapers in this country. You remember the newspaper is this thing you held in your hand to read the news before the internet. Stupid internet. As I'm making this for the internet, of course. Could also reproduce images cheaper. Nathaniel Currier began selling really reproduced prints, which will kind of begin to help create a national culture. I don't know if you've ever seen the Currier and Ives prints. I had grandparents that really loved those things. And it's just a cheap way to kind of get a print of some sort of art or landscape. So we're seeing a lot of changing. We're seeing a lot of changes in this time. We're also going to see, because of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, it's going to change the way we make things. We no longer work in our homes or in small shops. At least a lot of people aren't going to. We're going to begin to see new factory systems, which is going to bring in for the first time the idea of a work week. The way work used to be done before, say if you were someone who knew how to make shirts, what would happen is someone would bring you a bunch of cotton and they would give you a contract and you would have a certain due date to produce a certain number of shirts. And it was really up to you to decide how you're going to work. So you could work all around the clock at the beginning, get it done quick. You could work a little bit every day. You could be like a college student and do it the night before it's due. It was really up to you. Well, with the advent of steam-powered machines, it became easier to make things on machines, so you began to bring workers to you, which means that workers are going to have to learn to work in a timed fashion. We're going to begin to see for the first time the term work week. And that's something we're really going to talk about, especially in the next class, because we're going to see a lot of different kind of groups get exploited in the factories. There was a new factory system put up by Samuel Slater in Rhode Island. And what we begin to see also is bureaucracy. So no longer is the owner working next to the worker. You now have owners at the top, managers, then workers, and we're going to add more and more managers in there. We began using power-driven machines, and so we no longer needed as many skilled laborers. So this opens up jobs for unskilled laborers who you can pay a whole heck of a lot less than skilled laborers. So if you were someone who was skilled at making clothes, you were kind of out of luck during this period. We will see a separation of work and home life, but there will be a new ability to buy more goods. One, because they're going to be cheaper, and two, we're going to mass produce. Women will generally continue to work in the house, because after all, when women got married at the ripe old age of 20, 19, whatever, it was okay for women to work before they got married. But once they got married, it was their job to take care of the house and give their husband and children a nurturing environment and all that kind of good stuff. My niece is currently scowling at me. But that was kind of the thought. Basically, a woman's role after marriage was to take care of her family. Heck, in most places at this time, once a woman got married, she was considered to be legally dead. Now, what that means is a single woman could hold property, meaning like if her father had left her property, that property was hers. However, as soon as she got married, she's not allowed to own that property anymore. It goes to her husband. So even if the husband dies or they get divorced or whatever, which was a rare thing back then, she will not get that property back. So marriage is a really risky thing for women, but also kind of a necessary thing. So sometimes women would work at the home. They were for what they called outwork, sewing, things like that. So this was often necessary to supplement their income. Now, speaking of the ladies, in 1814, we have what is called the Lowell experiment, Lowell, or called the Waltham, Waltham system. And this was a factory complex for young women. This was a contained factory town, started with 22 mills. By 1850, it will have 50 mills. It was for young single women. They were recruited to work there. They built them dorms and libraries, even hired chaperones. Basically, they lived in boarding houses or dorm rooms with up to 10 people per room, 10 women per room. The chaperones were, of course, very important because, women could not be trusted with the young ladies could not be trusted with the boys and whatnot. In fact, we actually still saw this attitude as late as the 70s and 80s. At my alma mater, WKU, In the 1970s, there was a rule: if you had a guest of the opposite sex up in your room during the day, the door had to be open and 3 feet had to be on the ground at all times. That's how you made sure no shenanigans are going on. Uh, so that attitude probably isn't completely gone. So, what was this like? And I'm going to leave it up to you to decide whether or not this is good or bad for women. The workload was huge. These women worked 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. You had to have Sunday off because you were expected to go to church. In 1834, after a downturn in the economy, the owners cut the women's wages. This led to a strike. Many did not approve of strikes in this country, and in this case, they saw the strikes as being very unladylike. So it was very hard for workers to fight for their rights, especially women. But what we'll see after this time is a growth of factories, and it will lead to urbanization as more people come to the cities. New York will become the fashion and clothing capital of the world and the country. They will use southern cotton to make their clothes, so that'll make the two regions a little bit more dependent on each other, though not dependent enough. Workers wanted to begin to protect themselves and began forming labor organizations. They became upset when they realized that owners were making a whole lot more money and they weren't being paid particularly well. We have always been a capitalist society, but we don't necessarily like it when not everyone gets to share in the prosperity. We don't have a problem with people making a profit. That's cool. You came up with the idea. We have a problem when people make more money than they can possibly ever spend in their lifetime while their workers live in poverty. That has always kind of been the tension in the United States. So that basically ends the discussion on the market revolution. What I'm going to shift toward now is I just kind of want to talk about Southern society a little bit, which is normally where I get myself in trouble. So, what was life like in the South? Well, there were a few planters who lived in luxury and they dominated Southern society. They acted very much like an aristocracy. If you remember talking about medieval Europe in a history class somewhere, the idea of feudalism, lords and manors and serfs, in a lot of ways, that's what the South mirrors. Now, here's the important thing to remember. Most Southerners did not own slaves. Most slave owners held between 1 and 9 slaves. Less than 1% had 100 or more slaves in the South. Home and plantation life were weaved together. They weren't separate. Wives or oldest daughters often ran the plantation and was responsible for entertainment. Entertainment was very important for Southern aristocracy. If you remember, we talked about how the one thing Thomas Jefferson did is he threw a lot of lavish parties. Most Southerners were yeoman farmers. They owned very small farms or worked on the farms of others. By 1860, 3/4 of Southerners did not own slaves. And you might ask, then why is slavery so big in the South? Because if you're thinking about it, if you're one of these people who are not in the aristocracy, if you're someone who has to work for someone else, just from an economic point of view, you are at a major disadvantage if you have to compete against what is free labor. So why do regular Southerners continue to support slavery? Well, that's because of the ideology of white supremacy. And it was the only way that they knew that they could keep the entire population was in check is they could say to these white farmers, yeah, you live in poverty, you are poor, but at least you're not black. That was the whole idea of white supremacy. It was to hold together the structure, the ruling structure in the South. By the way, that's what's going to get me in trouble. That's what's going to offend somebody. But that's okay. That's how I see it. That's what I was told you in class. So if you were a regular Southerner, you basically had to rely on the community for some tasks. You mostly fed your family with a very little for commercial value. You had to depend on the plantation owners for use of mills, stoves, and other things. That's why I'm saying it's a lot like feudal society. The planter class dominated politics and the militia. As I mentioned, many Southerners actually owned no land and had to work as tenant farmers. That was between 30 and 50% of the white population were tenant farmers. But the ideology of white supremacy continued to permeate. 6% of African Americans in the South were free. Most of them lived in the Upper South, especially in river towns like Baltimore, Richmond, New Orleans, etc. New Orleans is actually a very special case. If you're interested in the racial history, check out New Orleans. It's very interesting. If you were a free African American in the South, you had to carry your identification at all times to prove that you were indeed free. They could not vote. There were some opportunities if you were skilled laborers and Southerners, but it was a pretty hard life. Southern cities were actually less segregated than northern cities, but I think that's probably because of the small number of free African Americans there. Religion will become very important to the black community. Southern black churches will have large memberships. Ministers were often community leaders. Now, you might ask, why was religion such a big deal? Well, the truth of the matter is, and again, this might get me in trouble, slave owners encouraged slaves to become Christian. And in some ways, it's about trying to save their souls and all that kind of good things. But in another way, it's also about societal control. So you're thinking about, what is the message of Christianity? Well, if you're going to boil it down, if you're going to ignore all the good stuff about treating each other fairly that Jesus talked about, it's ultimately saying that if you suffer in this life, you will be rewarded in the next life. So the idea there was to teach the slaves, yeah, it really sucks to be a slave, but because you believe in Christianity, you believe in Jesus, that when you die, you're going to get that mansion in the sky. That was a big thing they used to talk about. You're going to get rewarded. And so that was a means of control, meaning that the hope was that they would accept their role as slaves because they believed that when they died, they would be rewarded in some way. So it is a form of control. Now, it backfires, though, because they kind of read the whole Bible, a thing that, unfortunately, a lot of Christians have not done. I'm sorry, I'm being very, very controversial today. And they were drawn to the story of the Exodus. You remember the Exodus? That's where Moses goes and frees the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt. So that becomes a big part of African American slave Christianity in the South, is the desire to be free. And they will use their religion. They will actually create their own special form of religion. Everyone's heard of Old Negro Spirituals, beautiful songs. They're also used to communicate with other groups when planning things like slave rebellions. So that plan didn't necessarily work out so well. Wealthy white Southerners were very lavish in their lifestyles. They would hold parties, balls. You would have cotillions, coming out parties, which means something totally different back then than it does today. Fox hunts were very popular, though those were a big cheat. You would basically keep the fox in a cage all day before you would let them out, and you would have the dog sniff them all day so the dog could find them pretty quickly. So it was really kind of lame. I don't even know if you ate fox. I'm not a big fan of hunting if you're not going to eat it. Reputation and honor were very important in the South. There was a whole code of contact. When a quote unquote inferior insulted a quote unquote gentleman, the gentleman was allowed to respond by beating that person, the inferior, with a cane or a horsewhip. Actually happened in the House, in the Congress, when a Southern senator came over to the House and started horsewhipping a Northern congressman. If there was a problem between two gentlemen, the idea here was to duel. We talked about dueling somewhat, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr. In 1838, a man named John Wilson published a book called The Code of Honor, or the Rules of Government, or Government of Principles and Seconds in Dueling. So the Code of Honor was about how you did duels. Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay both fought duels. It was such a problem in Kentucky that to this day, and we're voting for a governor today, when the governor is sworn in, he has to swear that he has never participated in a duel. That would disqualify him or her from the office. Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay both fought duels. It was kind of an important thing for Southern culture. Slave labor will produce many agricultural crops: tobacco, hemp, sugar, and rice. Cotton, however, will be the biggest product. Most of it will be sent to Europe. There is a divide between the upper South and the lower South. The lower South was good for places like cotton. You had the black belt down there, especially around Alabama. Now, a lot of people kind of get confused by what black belt means. Some people think they call it the black belt because of the number of slaves. It's actually talking about the color of the dirt. It's very black, rich dirt, easy to grow things. The upper South, the 8 slave states, including Kentucky and Tennessee, were not as fertile, so they had more diversified agriculture, grain, and livestock, doing corn, rye, and hemp. Hemp is now making a comeback. Remind me when I get back, I'll tell you about hemp. And no, it's not the stuff you can smoke. At least I don't think you can. That would probably take a lot of work. Slaves were often sold from the upper South to the lower South because you didn't need as many in the upper South. You remember the slave trade ended in 1808, so that you had to get your slaves somewhere. And this was called being sold down the river, and it really destroyed a lot of slave families. A lot of slaves will be separated in this way.